Okay. Good evening and welcome. I want to thank all of you for coming. I'm Zeev Maoz. I'm professor of political science and director of the International Relations Program at UC Davis. And I'm pleased to have this opportunity to moderate the distinguished panel that will discuss challenges facing the Obama presidency. It may take a while before we can sum up and evaluate the Bush presidency. One thing seems quite obvious, however. The departing administration leaves a number of unresolved issues, economic, social, and international affairs. Each of these issues, in and of itself, presents an enormous challenge. As a whole, they seem almost insurmountable at least over the next few years. Yet the enormity of the task facing the Obama administration seems to be matched only by the level of expectation from the incoming president. Even as we speak, new crises erupt which will demand immediate attention of the president. The Gaza crisis is one example, but many expect other foreign policy crises to erupt in the next few months. The economy provides new reasons for concern and new pressure for action almost on a daily basis. One of the problems that faces presidents in general, but more so the incoming Obama administration, is that pressing matters would overshadow and postpone the important ones. Political leaders often allow tactics to dominate strategy. In some cases, tactics is all they are engaged in. The test of leadership involves the ability to manage current crises while also engaging in long-term planning and policy implementation that affects not only what we would read in the newspapers tomorrow, but the values, the structure, and the welfare of the society and perhaps the world at large for a very long time. Our panel of experts will engage in in-depth analysis of both immediate and long-term challenges facing the incoming administration. These analyses cover a wide range of topics. They cover social issues, they cover legal issues, they cover economic and international issues. There were a number of other important issues, for example, environmental issues, that we selected not to deal with this evening simply for the lack of time, not because they're less important than those issues that we will be covering tonight. And perhaps some of the panelists will touch upon these issues as well. I hope that the panelists will also offer some ideas of how the administration could or should manage these challenges. Before I present the distinguished panel, let me say a few words about the Institute of Governmental Affairs that sponsors this event. The Institute of Governmental Affairs is a center that sponsors research in the social sciences. This is its primary mission. But side by side this mission, IGA has an important commitment to serious discussion and analysis of social issues facing the United States and the world at large. Those of you who are not familiar with the events that IGA has been sponsoring over the years might be well advised to follow the UC Davis events website as well as the IGA website and check out the presentations that IGA offers. And these presentations, these events are open not only to UC faculty and students, but also to the general public, and we encourage members of the Davis and Sacramento and the Bay Area communities to participate in those events. I want to thank Ellen Olmsted, the director of IGA, for allowing this panel to happen. And I want to thank Mary Davis, who has been behind the logistics of this event. And without further ado, let me introduce the panelists. And we will go in the order of the program that was listed. I'd like to start with Professor Kimberlee Shauman. Professor Shauman is an associate professor of sociology. Her work focuses on social stratification, education, family, kinship, and gender. Her recent book is Women in Science, Career, Process, and Outcome, and it was published by Harvard University Press in 2003. Evan Taylor is professor of economics. He specializes in international economics, economic history, and development economics. He published numerous books and articles. The most recent book with Rob Feenstra is International Economics that was published earlier this year. Carlton Larson is an acting professor of law. He specializes in international law, legal history, federal courts, and criminal law and procedure. He received his law degree from Yale Law School, just like Hillary Clinton, whose confirmation took place this morning. Unlike Obama, who graduated from Harvard. And he had published in a number of law journals, including SMU Law, Yale Law, Washington Law Review, and Pennsylvania Law Review. Miroslav Nincic, my colleague in the political science department, is professor of political science, a former chair of the Department of Political Science, and a former director of the International Relations Program. He specializes in international security, U.S. foreign policy, and research methods. He published numerous books and articles in professional journals. His most recent book is called Renegade Regimes, Confronting Deviant Behavior in World Politics, and it's a very relevant topic a very relevant book to the kind of issues that the Obama presidency will face in the near future. So we all look forward. The format that we have is every member of the panel will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, during which time there will be no questions or comments. After all of the panelists have completed their presentation, we will open it up to questions and comments from the floor. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Shauman to talk about social challenges.
Thank you. So let me get this adjusted. Can you hear me all right? It's not working? Do I have to get closer? Is that better? Yeah, thank you. Okay, so let me begin by saying that there are a great number of social challenges that the new president and his administration will face, and he will face them along with the rest of us. I am not going to attempt a comprehensive list of these challenges. I am going to highlight 4 broad challenges that are very current, although they're current, but they're not new. They've been with us for quite a while now. I'll run through these topics rather quickly and with far too little detail, so I won't attempt that in-depth analysis that Zeev promised, but hopefully I'll get a lot of information out there that will inform discussion later. All right, so I'm going to talk about income inequality, educational inequality, incarceration rates, and health inequality. So let me first start by talking and spending the most time on income inequality. Throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century, the distribution of income in the United States has gone through what has been called the Great U-turn. The early 20th century was characterized by an extremely high degree of income inequality. The wealthy controlled the vast majority of all income and wealth, and the rest of the population shared what was left. This history is illustrated here by using trends in the percentage of all income that is earned by the top income decile, the top 10% of the income distribution. Prior to 1940, The top income decile earned about 45% of all income. The other 55% of the income was shared amongst the remaining 90% of the income distribution. The 40s witnessed a significant redistribution of income, however. The share controlled by the top decile declined to about 32% and held steady there until the 1980s. But since the 1980s, the U.S. has witnessed a very rapid increase in income inequality and return to the level of income inequality that was characteristic of the pre-Great Depression era, such that the gap between the wealthy and the rest of the population has increased very significantly. The underlying pattern of income growth that drove this return to high income inequality is shown here. Starting in the 1930s and continuing until the 1970s, workers in the bottom part of the income distribution experienced significant and sustained rates of growth in their earnings. Since the 1970s, however, the real value of income amongst the bottom 99% of the income distribution has been stagnant or has grown at very relatively low rates. In contrast, since the early 1980s, the incomes of the top part of the distribution have grown at very high rates. Transforming these average incomes into a ratio of the average income of the top 1% to the average income of the bottom 99% reveals that U-turn pattern once again. As of 2007, the average income of the top 1% of earners was 21.7 times that of the bottom 99%. So why is this? So I argue that this is one of the primary social challenges that faces our populace and the current administration, and it underlies a lot of underlies all of the other social challenges that I'll talk about and others that I won't have time to talk about. So why is this level of income inequality a social problem and a potential challenge for the new administration? Well, at the ideological level, this level of income inequality is inconsistent with, it's counter to the ideal of equality, which is foundational or fundamental to our country. It's a founding ideal of this country. But more concretely, high levels of income inequality are associated with, just to name a few, low levels of civic involvement, poor population health, high levels of educational inequality, high levels of potential social unrest, and low levels of social cohesion, just to name a few. Reducing income inequality is therefore likely to have very far-reaching and positive effects on our populace, on our society. So far all I've shown you is income inequality and dynamics in income inequality, but these dynamics of income inequality obscure some trends in income inequality that have been rather persistent over recent history. Specifically, racial gaps in earnings have stubbornly persisted since the 1970s. So if we look at the ratio, as I've shown here, the ratio of the median income of specific racial and ethnic groups compared to the median income of whites, we see that as of 2007, African Americans earn about 62 cents for every dollar earned by whites. The Hispanic white earnings ratio is not as large. Median income for Hispanics is 30% less than that of whites, but the gap appears to have increased slightly since the 1970s. These racial income disparities are echoed also in wealth disparities. Home ownership, value of home ownership is shown here. Home ownership is a primary vehicle for wealth in this country. It is the only source of wealth for the majority of the American population. And there are significant racial disparities both in rates of home ownership and in the value of homes that are owned. The persistent low rates of home ownership among African Americans and Native Americans, as well as the lower average values of their homes, means that this source of wealth and equity and financial equity, which can be essential for weathering financial crises such as the loss of a job or unexpected medical bills, and a source of equity that is used for financing higher education amongst children, that this resource is very unequally distributed. In addition to income disparities by race, income inequality between men and women remains a characteristic of our society. Despite the fact that women comprise half of the labor force and have closed the gaps in educational attainment and have closed the gaps in the types of education that's attained, among full-time year-round workers, women currently earn about 22% less than men. Since an increasing number of U.S. families are headed by single working women, and since the earnings of women currently is a major contributor to the incomes of dual earner families, families headed by married couples, this earnings gap has a direct implication for the financial resources that are available to those families and available to children growing up in those families. So the challenge is to identify, and the challenge for this particular inequality is to identify and address the causes of these persistent gaps. Evidence that policy can be used to redress, to really change the income distribution in this country is quite evident if we look at the trends in income inequality and map it onto the historical policy eras in the United States, or map those policy eras over the income inequality that we've tracked. The economic and social policies of the New Deal and the Fair Deal eras, in combination with strong deflationary pressures during the World War II, led to a remarkable compression of the income distribution, the remarkable compression of the income distribution that we saw during the 1940s. As the policies of the New Deal and the Fair Deal remained relatively intact throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the relatively low level of inequality of income inequality was maintained throughout that period. The very precipitous return to high rates of income inequality is attributed to the structural changes in the economy and changes in the occupational structure that began in the 1970s, as well as the fiscal policies introduced during the Reagan administration and continued thereafter through both Republican administrations and Democratic administrations. To address the challenge of income inequality, the new administration and the Congress will need to consider significant changes to the tax code, at least consider looking at the tax code as a policy tool for income redistribution. The current tax code is the outcome of 3 decades of decline in both the capital gains tax rate, as well as the tax rate for the highest income brackets. This lightening of the tax burden for the wealthy has come at the expense of the middle and working classes. The actions, also, we might look at the minimum wage as a policy lever that could be used. The real value of the minimum wage is now at its lowest level since the 1950s or 60s. This current level of the minimum wage is the outcome of both action and inaction on the part of Congress since the 1960s to do any sort of real movement on the minimum wage. Policies related to unionization also might be looked at. These policies have been, the strength of unions to represent the interests of workers have been significantly weakened, and bargaining power of labor has been significantly weakened through different laws and acts that have been enacted. These have been, the weakening of unions' bargaining power is associated with falling wages, with lessening benefits, and worsening working conditions for American workers. Also, an approach that the Obama administration appears poised to take immediately is to strengthen the rights of workers to challenge employment and pay discrimination. We have a great deal of sociological research that points to the persistence of discrimination in both employment and in setting of wages. President Obama has vowed to sign the Lilly Ledbetter Act, which passed the House last Friday and is headed toward the Senate. This act would increase the time that employees have to file pay equity claims, and it would overturn a recent Supreme Court decision that made it much harder for individual workers to challenge discrimination in employment, in education, in housing, and in many other areas. All right. I'm going to move on to education now. Educational inequalities also represent a significant challenge for our society and a challenge for the new president. Although the gap between whites and blacks in the completion of high school has closed, that gap has closed, the high school graduation rates amongst Hispanics continue to lag far behind the population average. The black-white inequity in rates of high school completion, however, so that good news, sorry, I'm going to follow it with some bad news. The good news obscures persistent racial gaps in academic achievement at the elementary and secondary level. The achievement of both African Americans and Hispanics falls far behind that of whites in all the areas that we test on a regular basis, including mathematics, science, and reading. Also, racial gaps in the completion of post-secondary education have not narrowed since the 1970s. These persist. In fact, the gap in college completion rates for whites and Hispanics has increased since the 1990s. And since attainment of higher education is a strong determinant of economic stability in the current economy, that's individual level economic stability, these disparities in educational attainment have set the stage for persistent racial gaps in income and wealth for a long time into the future. Even among high-achieving students, the successful completion of post-secondary education is dependent upon race and also upon socioeconomic status. So here, if we look at the college completion rates of a cohort of 8th graders whose educational pathways have been tracked since 1988, we find that Hispanic students are significantly less likely than whites and blacks to complete college. So given the same levels of achievement and potential, same levels of potential for educational achievement and contribution to the economy, they are not attaining a college degree at the same rates. The influence of socioeconomic status is even more pronounced. Among the same cohort of 8th graders, high achievement has less of an influence on college completion than does family income. High-achieving students who were from the lowest income quartile were no more likely to complete college than were students in the lowest achievement, who had the lowest achievement levels, but who were from families who had were in the highest quartile of income. So here you see the 30% for the low mathematics score, but highest income quartile compared to the 28.8% for the high mathematics score students who were in the lowest income quartile. So to address these educational inequities, the current administration must examine and potentially revamp the system by which our elementary schools and our secondary schools are funded. The current system is rife with very stark inequities. The goal should be to allocate funding and other resources according to need as well as according to program and curricular success. So we should be making more rational decisions on what our curriculums are looking like and how these resources are distributed. We now also have many years of research that should be brought to bear on rewrite of the No Child Left Behind Act. The goal should be here to keep those positive aspects, and we should definitely leave behind those aspects of that law which have been shown to be ineffective or to be detrimental to the educational success of young kids and the educational success of their teachers. Funding allocation to college loan programs must also be examined and revamped, or at least we should look at these college loan programs, grant programs, and scholarship programs that have been defunded over the past few years, and we should look at increasing those funds and targeting the distribution of those funds to young people according to financial need as well as according to academic achievement and future promise. Now I'm going to just talk very briefly about incarceration rates. Rising rates of incarceration are a characteristic of our recent society. These rising incarceration rates are a significant social challenge that must be addressed in the near future. Incarceration rates have exploded during the past decades, such that the total adult population under correctional supervision in the United States numbers 7.3 million. And at the current rates of increase, the current rates of increase are simply unsustainable. I would argue that current population load is absolutely unsustainable, not just given our current fiscal crisis, but given our more fundamental ideals. The rapid increase in the prison and parole populations, I have to note that this rapid increase in the prison populations has occurred during a time of declining crime rates. The rate of drug-related crime is the only, or the rates of drug-related crimes are the only crime statistic that has seen a sustained increase, and it has fueled much of the increase in incarceration. However, changes in sentencing laws and sentencing laws are more often attributed, or they're also attributed with driving this massive increase in prison populations. It should be noted also that racial inequality is starkly evident in this aspect of U.S. society as well. Incarceration rates for blacks are 5 to 6 times those of whites, and those for Hispanics are nearly 2 to 3 times those of whites. So the problems that high rates of incarceration bring to a community, including family separation, lack of earnings during incarceration, and also depressed earnings after incarceration due to the mark of a criminal record. These are all problems that are disproportionately experienced by particular communities in this society. They're not evenly distributed. They're more likely to be experienced in African American and Hispanic communities. The dramatic expansion of the prison population draws resources away from other policies and priorities. The members of the new administration should, for example, examine our approach to the control of illegal drug markets and the use of, and also we need to examine our sentencing laws. All right, I will conclude with a few statistics about health care in the United States. I'll start with the paradox that the United States spends more on health care than any other nation in the world, yet it ranks poorly on every measure of health status. Our poor population health seems to be the result of many factors, but the research shows that many Americans simply do not receive adequate health care. The health care that they receive is often too late, meaning that it's not primary care, it's not consistent care, and the quality of the care that is received is often poor. Despite the attention that this issue of health, that the issue of health insurance has received since before the 1992 election, the number of Americans without health insurance has increased, and the rate of insurance in the population has not improved. Access to health insurance is strongly correlated with both income and with race. Those with low income are the least likely to have the opportunity to gain health insurance through their employers or to be able to purchase health insurance through the private market. This just shows that the uninsured are also much more likely to be members of ethnic minorities, particularly Hispanics, but also African Americans. I'm going to skip over that. Although a lack of health insurance is by no means the only cause of inequities in health, it is likely to be a direct contributor and also a proxy for other contributing influences, such as exposure to poor housing, unsafe or highly stressful work conditions, lack of access to healthy food, and so on. The extent of such disparities, as well as their persistence, are reflected in differences in life expectancy. This graph presents life expectancy at births for blacks and whites separately for males and females throughout the 20th century. And what you will note here is the persistency of the gap between blacks and whites. Despite a century of advances in medical knowledge, technology, and public health, at the end of the 20th century, black men can expect to live 7.2 fewer years on average than whites, and black women can expect to live 5.3 years fewer than white women. Epidemiologists estimate that a large proportion of this racial gap for males and females is attributable to 3 causes of death: cardiovascular disease, homicide, and HIV. It is important to note that each of these causes of death can be significantly reduced through public health efforts to effect behavioral change and social policy efforts to improve access to better education and employment opportunities. It will take comprehensive approaches to address each of these social challenges that face the new president. The good news is that although each of these challenges is pretty significant on its own, they are not mutually exclusive. since they are interrelated policy efforts that are aimed at directly addressing any one of these social challenges is likely to have indirect effects on the other social challenges. I'll conclude by stating that while the leadership of a new president will be essential for addressing these and other social issues, an informed citizenry is also essential to parse through the debates and the lobbying efforts that will accompany the efforts at progressive new policies to address these social problems. Thank you.
I would like to invite Ellen Taylor to talk about economic challenges.
Thank you, Zeev, for that introduction and the opportunity to be here tonight. And I also appreciate Kimberlee Shauman's presentation, which I think covers a lot of important economic as well as social issues, many of which I'm not going to focus on, so there's some complementarity there, although I think all of those are very important issues. I'm going to focus on perhaps more tactical rather than strategic considerations, as Zeev would put it, and focus on the crisis of the moment and how this presidency will respond to that. So I think the major challenges for economic policymakers are going to be dominated by the response to the current crisis. And I think this will be the major preoccupation for all of them, and perhaps for all of us, for the next 4 years. So we could still be in the process of recovery from the current crisis, even as we enter Obama's second term, if there is such a second term. So I've highlighted here 5 challenges that I think will be at the center of economic policymakers' attention in the next few years. First of all, challenge number 1, output and unemployment. We are about to head into an enormous recession, and I'll discuss how enormous it is likely to be in a moment, but it could well be the biggest recession we have seen since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And the problems this will pose for our economy, for our society, and for the world as a whole should not be underestimated. Challenge number 2, which is obviously correlated with challenge number 1, is dealing with the after effects of the financial bubble and crisis. So if we want to confront challenge number 1, we have to confront, I think, some of the underlying causes. So whereas we might want to rely primarily on macroeconomic policies to deal with challenge number 1, we have to realize that a lot of the problems that we're dealing with really have deeper causes associated with toxic assets and high leverage in the financial system. We have to figure out how to unwind all of those problems whilst minimizing social losses. Challenge number 3 peels the onion a little further and notes that many of those problems stem from a housing bubble and now a housing crisis. And the response there is kind of ditto in the sense that we have to detoxify our own household balance sheets in many cases and deleverage ourselves as private households. And the government will face a challenge there of how to handle that process whilst minimizing social losses. The fourth challenge is maybe a little more strategic than tactical, as is challenge number 5. As we move through this process, we are going to pile up a whole load of public debt. We're going to have to run deficits and increase our debt burden. And that raises the question for me of what risks that poses to the United States and its position in the world economy and our ultimate economic health in the longer run once this recession is over. And the fifth challenge is about the US and the rest of the world. We're obviously not sovereign in that environment, whereas we are perhaps with respect to the first 4 challenges. As we've learned, we're not sovereign in the world as a whole, economically or otherwise. But we do have a special position. We're a very large economy. We're a very wealthy economy. We have very good economic institutions relative to many other countries, and that places us in a position of privilege, a position of good fortune, and the question is how we can preserve that position for ourselves, and also how we can use that position to try to help the rest of the world cope with what is going to be a challenging economic environment in the years ahead. So, to specify in a little bit more detail these challenges, output and employment, here is what the Congressional Budget Office issued in a report a few days ago, and it's called the GDP gap, if you like, the gap between potential and actual gross domestic product. How far from our potential output are we going to be? And this chart runs from 1945 through projections beyond the dashed line through beyond 2015. Maybe the projections end in 2014, actually. And you can see marked on this chart various recessions that have occurred in the post-war period, including a sort of double-dip recession there in the early 1980s, the recession of the early 90s, around 91, and the recession in 2001. And what strikes me about this chart, and most commentators who've looked at it in the last few days, is that we are in for a very deep recession by historical standards, by the standards of the last 50 years. Certainly by the standards of the last 20 years compared to what happened in around 91 or 2001. Many people in the workforce don't know what is about to hit them. Many people were not born when the last major recession took place in the early 1980s. This is going to be a very severe downturn in terms of cumulative GDP loss, and the flip side of that is high unemployment. Right? So here's a chart from the Christine Naroma Jared Bernstein report, which was issued a couple of days ago, showing the likely path of unemployment without the recovery plan, which they have announced. So if you like, the upper path here shows the path of unemployment if there were no macroeconomic policy response in terms of fiscal stimulus. And it's pretty bad. We are talking here about unemployment elevated above current levels well out past 2012. In other words, the economy would be below potential and below what you might consider an acceptable level of unemployment for the next 4 years, for the entire duration of Obama's term. The darker blue line here shows what they are hoping to achieve through what will strike many of you as an unprecedented level of fiscal stimulus, borrowing, spending, tax cuts, whatever will work, you name it, they plan to try it. What's striking about this track for unemployment with the recovery plan is that it still looks pretty bad, right? It only takes away about half the pain over this entire period. And I believe they're being fairly conservative here with how much bang for the buck they think they will get and how far they can go. But this really testifies to the challenge here. Because the recession is going to be so bad, it's going to be very hard to address. How are you going to find enough public works projects or spending projects that will deliver enough bang for the buck to prop up demand? Maybe you can't. Can you be sure that if you put more money into tax breaks, people will actually spend that as opposed to hoarding it? Maybe you can't. Can you do all of these things without ballooning the US public debt? Maybe you can't. This is an extremely tricky proposition. Now, why are we in that position? Some people think we're in that position because monetary policy has basically, run out of room for maneuver, that we're tapped out there. We've hit ZIRP, or the zero interest rate policy, and that leaves the Fed with no further room for maneuver. I would just say here I'm not quite so convinced of that. Are we at the zero limit? Well, if you go into the bank, they won't let you have free money. And banks won't lend to each other at a zero interest rate. In fact, interest rates are extremely elevated due to perceived counterparty risks between banks. They don't trust each other. They're not lending much money out either because they want to put it in the kitty and just sit on it to try to protect themselves against a rainy day. So this is a problem for the Fed. The monetary transmission mechanism is basically broken, and there's much more work to do there, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But this is another reason why we're in deep trouble and why high priority must be given to the financial system if we're going to address these economic problems in an effective way. Still, fiscal policy will have to be aggressively expansionary. They're hoping to add 3 million jobs, but as the previous chart shows, we're still left with the question of will this be enough? It's only going to close about one half of the gap, and we're going to put the economy through a pretty serious downturn if we don't do something else. So that brings me to challenge number 2, the financial crisis. And this chart just shows the stock prices of various banks over the last few months. I think maybe over a year, yeah. You can tell these are banks because there's Lehman Brothers and it's gone to 0. And I guess, Citibank is the red line, that perhaps they're headed into similar territory soon. They've lost 50 to 60 to 70% of their value. The banks are in a terrible state, right? They have eaten up almost all of their equity value and are teetering on the brink, right? The flip side of that is if you look at various spreads representing counterparty risk for deals with banks, this is the spread between what treasuries pay and the rate at which banks lend to each other. Right? And usually you can see going back into 2007 and before, this would normally be around a 0.5 percentage point. And then in mid-2007, it spiked up to around 1.5 percentage points. It was elevated at that level through the later half of 2007 and into 2008. And then after the Lehman Brothers failure in September of 2008, it jumped up to several hundred basis points or several percentage points, peaking at around 4.5. So basically, there's just nothing going on here in terms of the normal flow of credit between financial intermediaries, and that is having severe negative effects on the real economy. This is a real drag. The Fed can push all it wants on its lending rate, but if it's not transmitted through banks into the lending prices and quantities seen by private households and private businesses, the Fed cannot stimulate the economy at all. Right? So I would apply a caveat to what's been said about the Fed running out of options. The Fed could have quite effective monetary policy options left if they had a transmission mechanism. But try driving a car with a broken transmission, you're not going to get very far. And that's reflected in what's happening to monetary stocks right now. The Fed has injected incredible amounts of base money in the last few months, as shown here by the red line. That's cash that is being emitted by the Fed into the rest of the universe, right? And the blue line is the broader money supply M1, right, which includes currency in circulation and checking deposits and so forth. And what we notice here is that base money has actually crossed M1 because we've stuffed so much money into banks, but all they're doing is stuffing it right back into the Fed to hold in the vault, earning some interest now, these reserves of the banks. They're simply not lending it out. For the economics geeks in the audience, we now have a money multiplier here that's less than 1, right? That just, has never happened, right? So that's pretty bad. Why is this happening? Because banks' balance sheets are full of junk, right? Bad assets, loans that have gone bad. The Fed is doing everything to try and allow the banks to keep lending and to try to hide, cover up, make you think there's no problem here, right? So they're lending freely, even against dubious collateral and without any penalty whatsoever. This, of course, violates many precepts of lender of last resort actions as laid down since the 19th century, when you should lend freely against good collateral at a penalty. But we'll just, throw those sensible precepts out of the window. There have been some constraints on what the authorities have done. Remember TARP 1, the Paulson plan. The idea was we'd just take the bad assets off the bank's balance sheets and give them nice, clean, pristine money in return. That was not very popular because it was going to be, a $700 billion gift from taxpayers to banks. We're in a slightly better situation now in that we've injected capital, which means we'll get our money back as long as they don't fail. How can we be sure they won't fail? Well, I guess we can keep injecting more money into them. All of this is because we don't want the bondholders to have to pony up and accept some of the losses. It may well be that the equity holders will be wiped out. But the problem is we injected the capital without first checking if these institutions were solvent, right? Which is kind of backwards if you think about it. So 70 years ago, FDR had to invent a bank holiday and a bank restructuring, in the first 7 days of his administration, and he got that policy reform in the right order. He went out and sent out bank auditors first, figured out how much bad debt the banks had to write down, and then injected the capital afterwards, so that it wasn't simply propping up bad institutions and placing so much taxpayer resources at risk. So needless to say, I'm not in agreement with what has gone on so far, and it hasn't been very effective anyway. So it might be time to try something new there. So we need to figure something out. We probably need to make banks either go through a failure or a nationalization or a speed bankruptcy or something that will get these bad assets off the balance sheet, but do so without passing on huge costs to the taxpayer. And I think this problem is only going to get worse as we go on because the real fundamentals are getting worse. Right? So a lot of these bad assets simply stopped being traded. They were illiquid about 12 months ago when the banks saw that they were getting like 22 cents on a subprime mortgage. Well, that was in early 2007 when no one thought there was a recession. How much do you think that subprime mortgage is worth now? Right? So I think these losses are going up exponentially and will only cause further problems. And there's going to be an enormous political fight about how much of a subsidy or a transfer we should or should want to give to bank equity and bondholders. Further down the road, there's going to be then the strategic problem of how do we prevent this happening again. And a redesign of the financial system will surely be coming down the pike. Okay, where did a lot of this problem come from in terms of the deeper determinant? Well, it's the housing bubble. Relative to inflation, house prices just went through an enormous run-up, an unsustainable run-up in the early 2000s, only to fall precipitously in the last year or so. And the ratio of, this is ratio of house prices to inflation, but you'd see the same pattern if you looked at the ratio of house prices to rental values, for example. Why did this happen, and how did it happen, and what was it associated with? Well, one thing it was associated with was an increase, a big run-up in the home ownership rate. Right? So these data here go back to the 1960s, and you can see that home ownership was sort of stable at around 63, 64, 65%. And then starting in the early 1990s, this kind of cranked up towards 70%. So we're stuffing more people into houses. How can we do that? Well, I guess we've got to lend them money. But these are the people on the margins who couldn't get into the houses before, so I guess we had to lower our standards to let them get the mortgages that got them into the houses, which, you know, might be called risky, right? So we have this problem then that we have lots of people going into risky mortgages, subprime mortgages, and they default a lot. Maybe they cope with it for the first few years when they've got a teaser rate, but then reality hits, or they lose their job, or something happens, and then the foreclosure rate goes up on those loans, which you can see here in the last few years. Not only is that rate accelerating, there are more and more people in that bin, right? We're putting more and more people into the subprime bin, creating a monstrous problem. So another financial policy reform is needed there to ensure that we don't go down that road again. What can the responses of policymakers be here? I think it's pretty futile to try and twist prices away from fundamentals. They're going to go there anyway. And again, there's going to be a political fight about whether we should be bailing out the irresponsible, whether it be the bankers who made the loans or the foolish people who took them out. However, we seem to be bailing out irresponsible people elsewhere, like on Wall Street, so there's going to be a, like, if it's good enough for them, why isn't it good enough for us kind of argument. We don't want to violate private contracts. That would be problematic. But we would like mortgages to be renegotiated between borrowers and lenders. The problem is securitization has now separated borrower from lender. And, I don't know who the hell owns my mortgage, but it's been chopped up into bits and sent off into the ether. Right? So we would like that process to be streamlined. We would like the mortgage owner who's about to default and be foreclosed on and the lender to be able to renegotiate some kind of terms that will prevent the two parties having to go through a costly or excessive foreclosure. So there may be some policies there that can be put into effect. Turning finally to a strategic question, though, do we have to really sort of think as a society, and do the policymakers have to think about this sort of home ownership myth? Why do we want more home ownership? What is the optimal rate? Do we want to push it to 100%, over 100%? I don't know. I mean, there's a reason people rent. They're at stages in their life, or they have incomes or fluctuations in their incomes or in their circumstances, which means that renting might be a more sensible path to take. And as an investment in the last few years, it's certainly been a very good path to take. And yet we've designed all these institutions like the GSEs, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and the Federal Home Loan Bank Boards, and lots of other acronyms that I can't even remember, to try and get more and more people into houses. and saddled with these mortgages and exposed to these risks. It's not clear that was a smart move. Fourth challenge, debts and deficits. Well, if we're going to bail out all these parties, spend a lot of money to keep output up and employment down, we're going to be running up big debts and deficits. And these numbers look scary. Here there's public debt, and then there's gross debt, including all the social security and other obligations held by the government in a kind of accounting ruse. But basically all of these lines have been trending up. It doesn't look as bad when you scale it by GDP, however. Public debt in this country was, I say was, these data I think run through 2006 or 7, was around 25% of GDP, if we exclude debt from one part of the government to the other. You'll see much higher ratios in other countries, so we're not looking so profligate, although you might be worried by some of the trends there. So, maybe we're okay. Maybe we're not, at a high debt ratio yet in terms of our government debt. Private debt may be a different matter. And yet, in the last few months, we have been spending, phenomenal amounts in the Treasury, spending money on the TARP, and acting in concert with the Fed to issue guarantees to the financial sector. If all of those chickens come home to roost, we could be exposed to hundreds of billions, getting into several trillion dollars worth of additional public debt, which will cause that debt ratio and debt number to spike up quite a lot. And there the concern has to be, again, strategic and long-term. We are very fortunate to live in a country which has never defaulted, has never had serious inflation, has never had major debt problems. There's only a couple of countries for which that can be said, going back 200, 300 years. And it really does give us an incredible privilege. Investors view us as a safe haven. We can borrow at incredibly low rates, like 0 right now. And we don't want to fritter that away, right? We'd like that to be there for the long term, because we know other countries which have had debt and inflation problems where life is much less pleasant. Fifth challenge, I'm almost out of time. I knew I would be, so I haven't got as many slides here, is globalization and U.S. global economic leadership. And what I would say here is that over the last 50 years, partly through U.S. leadership, but through international cooperation as well, we've seen a growth of international trade and finance that has been unprecedented in economic history. And it's delivered enormous opportunities for production, specialization, and investment that would have been unimaginable in the past. And there's been a lot of economic benefit from that. We'd really like to preserve those economic benefits, but there are serious questions about distributional issues. Where are those benefits going? Who gains? Who loses? Who is exposed to some of those risks? The risks of crises or the risks of jobs being shifted around. So I think we can take steps to address those problems, and I hope the administration will do that. But we would like to do that without going down the protectionist path and throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Otherwise, we will only make the pain worse now, and also will make it worse in the long run. So there is a problem. Protectionism and isolation is attractive right now to lots of governments around the world and their constituents. But it's very dangerous economically and also potentially geopolitically. Mostly the US has avoided this path in the last century. 19th century might be a different story. Smoot-Hawley in 1930 was perhaps the most famous or infamous exception at the time of the Great Depression. But for the most part, the US has played a very important role in restoring, expanding, and preserving these international economic freedoms. And I think we'll be facing that test again. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to invite Carlton Larson to talk about legal and constitutional challenges.
Put this down. Okay, thank you. I'm happy to be here to discuss legal and constitutional challenges facing the incoming Obama administration. Now, there are significant challenges in this area, no doubt. But the upside here is that I think they are considerably less daunting than the challenges posed in the area of the economy, the environment, and foreign relations. And that's because in many cases, the solutions to these challenges are relatively straightforward. We know what to do, often involving simple reversal of certain policies of the Bush administration. Moreover, President-elect Obama is uniquely qualified to address these issues. As a lawyer and a constitutional law professor, he knows as much as anyone in his administration what ought to be done. Now, I want to focus on two broad areas. First, personnel, the president's appointments, and secondly, substance, the content of the president's constitutional and legal decisions. Now, first, the people. Here, the most significant decision the president will have to make will be whom to appoint to the United States Supreme Court. It is likely that there will be at least one vacancy, possibly as many as 3, over the next 4 years. Now, it's important to note that these potential vacancies are highly unlikely to change the ideological makeup of the Supreme Court in any significant way. That's because all of the justices most likely to retire are the 4 so-called liberal justices. The court currently consists of 5 conservative justices and 4 moderates, sometimes referred to as liberals, although I don't think they're particularly liberal, at least compared to, say, justices on the Warren Court. Now, the 5 conservatives include 3 members in their 50s and 2 in their early 70s. To change the court's ideological balance, one of those 5 justices must be replaced. That simply doesn't seem very likely in the next 4 years, or indeed in the next 8 years. If the court is to change, it really would be as a result of the 2016 presidential election. And here, the turning point really was the 2004 presidential election. That gave President Bush the opportunity to replace Justice O'Connor and Chief Justice Rehnquist. If those appointments had been made by a President Kerry, we would now have a moderate to liberal court. Now, that's not to say that the 2008 election wasn't important. It was. If John McCain had won and had the opportunity to replace one or more of these liberal justices, we would have a reliably conservative court for the next 30 years. So President Obama essentially maintains the status quo with respect to the Supreme Court. And the big issue here is whether he selects a relatively liberal nominee, or does he select more of a moderate, as Bill Clinton did with Justices Ginsburg and Breyer. And it's very hard to know. My guess is that he might pick more of a moderate so as to avoid a divisive confirmation battle that would focus on a lot of polarizing social and cultural issues that Obama has tended to avoid. But it's hard to say, and the calculus may well vary depending on how many openings there are. If there are 2 or 3, he may feel more comfortable nominating somebody who is quite liberal if he also nominates a moderate or 2. Now, I should also note that the current Supreme Court, for the first time in American history, consists entirely of former federal appellate judges. President Obama would almost certainly try to find nominees with a broader range of experience, perhaps people with significant political background, or perhaps, since he has a bit of an academic bent, perhaps some even academics. Now, in addition to appointments to the Supreme Court, the president will appoint several hundred judges to positions on the lower federal courts. These judgeships matter a lot. Most issues never reach the United States Supreme Court, so who sits on the lower courts can be decisive in a wide range of cases. Now, President Clinton, himself a former constitutional law professor like Obama, paid surprisingly little attention to judicial nominees, often horse trading them as part of his legislative dealings with Congress. He ultimately appointed a number of moderate and conservative justices to the lower federal courts. Republican presidents, by contrast, have been much more focused on the lower courts and have made it a point to make sure that the appointments are of the appropriate political ideology. So the big question about Obama with respect to the lower courts is, will he focus on ideological purity, as Republicans have, or will he treat the judgeships as simply one more avenue for compromise, as did President Clinton? And again, it's very hard to know. I guess we'll know once we see the first raft of nominations. Now, the last point on the president's people, I'd like to speak just a little bit about the United States Department of Justice. There are very serious problems in the Justice Department. Over the last 8 years, this is a department that I think has suffered some pretty serious hits. There are two types of jobs for lawyers at the Justice Department. At the very top are the political appointees of the President who make the key decisions on the most significant issue and who serve at the pleasure of the President. We expect these people to be political appointments and to act in some ways politically. But the vast majority of Justice Department attorneys are career civil servants who, by law, must be selected on the basis of merit alone without regard to political affiliation. When I was in law school, these jobs in the Justice Department were widely regarded as some of the most prestigious and interesting that a lawyer could hold. And one of the most serious mistakes the Bush administration made, which I don't think quite received enough media attention as it should have, was to politicize the hiring of these career attorneys. Resumes were carefully screened to ensure that only Republicans were hired for these civil service jobs. Some of the ghastly details of how exactly that worked were released today in an Inspector General's report, concluding that the hiring laws had been repeatedly violated. And this process, not surprisingly, by significantly narrowing the pool of potential hires, resulted in the hiring of significantly less talented lawyers than would have otherwise been the case. And these problems extended not only to hiring, they extended to issues of staffing. Senior career attorneys were shoved off of important cases, given significantly less interesting and important assignments. And not surprisingly, dozens of career Justice Department attorneys ultimately ended up leaving the department, giving up, and going into private practice and making more money. This is, I think, a big problem. But again, it is relatively easy to fix. Just don't do this anymore. And I'm pretty confident that President Obama and his Attorney General designate, Eric Holder, with whom I worked when I was in private practice, will do what they need to do to make sure that the Justice Department hiring is done on the basis of merit and not on the basis of political affiliation. Now, the second broad subject is the specific substantive constitutional and legal decisions the President will make. Now, one of the most striking aspects of the Bush-Cheney administration has been its aggressive interpretation of presidential power, arguing that the President has freestanding authority by virtue of several provisions in Article 2 of the Constitution to flout the will of Congress and to act unilaterally in almost every area that touches on national security. Now, I suspect President Obama will step back from some of these far-reaching theories, but probably not as much as many of his current supporters imagine. After all, it was relatively easy over the last 8 years to criticize presidential power if you were a Democrat and you didn't particularly like George W. Bush. But just think back 10 years ago when Bill Clinton, a Democrat, was president and the Republicans controlled the Congress. At that time, Republicans in Congress sought to subpoena nearly every presidential document imaginable, and for his part, the Democratic president entered United States armed forces into a war in the former Yugoslavia without any congressional approval whatsoever. Going further back, when President Nixon was a young congressman, he complained bitterly about President Truman's refusal to turn over certain White House documents to Congress. And of course, we all know how Nixon's views on that issue changed once he got to the White House himself. Recently, I saw an op-ed by John Yoo of Berkeley, one of the primary architects of expansive presidential power under the Bush administration. And in this op-ed, Professor Yoo argued for a heightened role for the Senate with respect to treaties to make sure that Obama didn't make commitments to foreign countries without the consent of Congress. You changed sides on this issue even before Obama has been sworn in. This is not an area, the basic nature of presidential power, where one expects to find a lot of consistency. You support presidential power if you like the president and not otherwise. So do I see Obama making significant early overt moves to drastically limit his own power? No. Why would he? What point would that serve? Now, I don't think I go quite as far as this. This is the cover of this week's Newsweek, which came to my mailbox yesterday, and it says, "What would Dick do? Why Obama may soon find virtue in Cheney's vision of power." Now, that's probably a little bit extreme, but the basic idea is there. Obama will be tempted, not surprisingly, in a number of situations to assert fairly broad notions of presidential power. What will he do specifically, though? What I think specifically he will do is reverse a handful of Bush policies that were themselves improperly grounded on broad presidential authority. First, I think Obama will not claim a power to engage in warrantless wiretapping of American citizens in the United States. Again, that practice can be ended fairly quickly. Secondly, I think Obama will offer realistic interpretations of American laws prohibiting torture, and that torture of detainees will end immediately. Third, I think Obama will not claim executive privilege with respect to as many documents as Bush has done, and that in general he'll have a much more constructive relationship with Congress than Bush did. One of the curious things about the Bush administration was when they had a Republican Congress in their corner, why they went out of their way, it seemed, to antagonize Congress and deliberately keep Congress out of the loop. That caused, as a result, them to lose many cases in the Supreme Court that they probably could have won if they had involved Congress in the first place. Now, President-elect Obama will also face significant decisions with respect to the detention of so-called enemy combatants. There is one such alleged enemy combatant, Ali al-Mari, currently detained by the United States military here in the United States. And his case is currently pending in the United States Supreme Court. I've been involved in the case in a minor role in the lower courts. And the Bush administration took the position that it could detain any non-citizen captured in the United States, including, in this case, a foreign graduate student lawfully admitted on a student visa while living in Illinois with his family. This will be one of the first key decisions the Obama administration makes, as the government's briefs are due in the Supreme Court in February. I suspect that President Obama and the new political appointees at the Justice Department will change course and concede that Mr. al-Mari cannot be held by the military, but one cannot know for sure. And this will be an important early signal as to how Obama will approach these issues of enemy combatant detentions. Now, an even trickier problem is presented by the Guantanamo detainees. Now, not surprisingly, everybody, including President Bush, wants to close Guantanamo. And Obama has said that he will issue executive orders on the first day to begin that process. But it's one thing to close a particular detention facility. It's quite another to determine what exactly to do with the detainees themselves. Some of them might be tried under a properly constituted military tribunal. Some of them might be tried in regular criminal courts. And some of them could be released. But released to where? Many of the detainees' home countries refuse to accept them, and it would probably be highly dangerous to simply grant them admission to the United States. This is, I think, an exceptionally difficult problem, and I suspect it will take some time to get resolved, perhaps by significant diplomacy with other countries to persuade them to accept the detainees. Indeed, Obama has indicated that Guantanamo will probably remain open longer than he had originally hoped, partly because of these problems. Moreover, given the fact that the military is continually engaged in operations in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and possibly in Pakistan, the military will inevitably capture more people who need to be detained somewhere. If not in Guantanamo, they'll probably simply be held in Afghanistan. And many of the same legal problems we've had with Guantanamo will reemerge with respect to detentions in Afghanistan. These problems are tough. They're inherent, I think, in this type of conflict, and they won't go away simply because we've replaced President Bush with President Obama. But that said, I do think these problems are much, much easier than those confronting his foreign affairs or his economic teams, and I suspect he will devote a relatively small proportion of his time to these particular issues. Thank you.
Last but not least, I'd like to invite Miroslav Nincic to talk about foreign policy challenges.
It's obvious that the weight of the foreign policy challenges facing the new president is equal in weight and equal in complexity, probably, to those facing him with regard to the economy. I think, though, that the consequences of failed foreign policies are probably likely to be graver than the consequences even of failed economic policies. And I think that the foreign policy challenges are located at two levels, and I will discuss one of the two levels today. The first level is that of simply improving the general image and conception of the United States that's held by citizens in other countries. And I don't think that there is any doubt that the view held of the United States is not what it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, certainly not what it was 50 years ago. And overcoming the image of an arrogant unilateralist country, shedding the image, or shedding a situation where the image evoked by the United States is no longer that of the Statue of Liberty, but more that of Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, will definitely be one of the major general challenges that this president will face. I think he is up to that particular challenge. There are also a number of specific problems, specific threats that this administration will have to grapple with, and these are likely to be even more complex and even more difficult. And when I began preparing this presentation, I had a list of about half a dozen threats and challenges, and then I rapidly realized that there was no way I could squeeze a sensible discussion of all of them into the 20 minutes which I'm allotted, so I will limit my discussion to three particular threats and challenges, but I will be happy to discuss others. I'll be happy to discuss the situation in Afghanistan, the relations with Russia, whatever it is that you feel is worth discussing. But the three challenges, specific threats that I want to dwell on are that involving the current situation in the Middle East, particularly as it has developed in the last 2.5 weeks following the Israeli invasion of Gaza. I would like to discuss the situation in Iran and the possible consequences of Iran's acquiring a nuclear weapon. And I would then like to discuss an issue which is surprisingly off the radar screen of most commentators and of much of the media, and has been for a while, and that is the problem of North Korea. And in fact, where nuclear threats are concerned, I am far more sanguine in the short term about the nuclear threat from Iran than I am about that from North Korea. So I want to say a few words about that too. But let me begin talking about the Middle East. Current developments in the Middle East have placed the president-elect in a difficult conundrum. On the one hand, there are his professions of almost unconditional support to Israel expressed during the course of the campaign. And on the other hand, there is the fact of the immense and truly horrible suffering of the Palestinian people in the last few weeks. And somehow he has to navigate around these two issues, a drive to ensure Israel's security and a drive to do something for the long-suffering Palestinians. And I want to say just a few words about this particular issue and this particular problem. It is not an issue of a struggle of good against evil, of vice against virtue. It is at its essence a struggle of two people for the same patch of land. And a struggle of two people for the same patch of land is, believe it or not, sometimes more difficult to resolve than questions that involve ethical contraries. These are two people who are struggling for the same patch of land and who have managed in the process, in one case by deed, in another case by word, to try to deprive the other side of its right to participate in a common humanity. And this makes the problem intractable because of the vulnerabilities and anger that's been created in that part of the world. There is, in addition, what has been called the boomerang effect, the fact whereby terrorism in the Palestinian world bolsters the position of right-wing politicians in Israel who, through their harsh treatment of Palestinians, further exacerbate the anger of Palestinian Arabs and their willingness to engage in terrorist activity, which further strengthens the hand of right-wing politicians, and so forth and so on. But the current problem, the current issue, is that surrounding the invasion of Gaza. And it is an invasion which the Bush administration has regarded, I would say, with equanimity. It has not been something that it opposed any more than it opposed the invasion of southern Lebanon to deal with Hezbollah 2.5 years ago. And the reason it has not opposed it is largely because it thought it might serve a beneficial purpose, that it might lead to the physical destruction of Hamas, and therefore to an altered balance of power in this part of the world, one that would be ultimately more conducive to peace. And I am the first to say that if the dominant and only result of the Israeli invasion of Gaza had been a destruction of Hamas, for whom nobody I know has a whole lot of sympathy, and if it did in fact promote the cause of peace in the Middle East, I would be the last to criticize it. But this has not been, and doesn't seem to be in the process of being, the dominant outcome of the invasion of Gaza. To begin with, the Hamas command structure and ability to do harm has been damaged, it has not been destroyed. And according to Israeli intelligence sources reported in today's New York Times, the command structure remains virtually intact. In fact, most of it was, of course, located in Syria. And under the circumstances, I think that President Obama has to count on the fact that Hamas will continue to be a player in Middle Eastern politics for several years, at least to come. And what does he do under the circumstances? Well, what I would propose that he should do, and what I hope he would do, is to take the steps needed to delegitimize Hamas without feeling that this must be done by harming the Palestinian and hurting the Palestinian people as much as possible. One of the problems associated with the considerable civilian destruction in Gaza has been that a hurt and humiliated Palestinian people is finding increasing psychological satisfaction and gratification in the fact that Hamas is fighting back. It has deepened the anger of very many non-Palestinian Arabs against Israel. It has made it harder for moderate countries such as Jordan and Egypt not to harden their own stance vis-a-vis Israel. And the point is that even those who find Hamas most despicable and who recognize that Israel has the right to defend itself from unprovoked rocket attacks, and who feel that it has the right to do something, don't feel that it has the right to do anything. And at the moment, and Professor Maoz will correct me if I'm wrong, according to data tabulated by Israeli human rights groups, I think it is 21 Israelis that have died since 2001 from Hamas rocket attacks. Over 900 Palestinians have died in the last few weeks due to this military incursion. Thousands are wounded. Entire families have been decimated and destroyed. And by some estimates, 40% of the victims are women and children. That may be an overestimate, but it's a number that is floating around. The idea is not to harm Palestinians. The idea and goal is to delegitimize Hamas, and you delegitimize Hamas by demonstrating to the Palestinians the virtues and benefits to be had from abandoning the kind of rejectionism that Hamas has always stood for. And I think that you do so largely by a progressive, and as a first step, by a progressive and responsible opening of the border between Israel and Gaza, letting a bit of fresh air, possibilities for earning a livelihood begin to permeate the Gaza Strip, while at the same time doing whatever is necessary, and the European Union has offered considerable help here in preventing the incursion through underground tunnels of rocket-building material from Egypt into Gaza, but open possibilities for a decent life for Palestinians, and stick to the goal of a two-state solution. A two-state solution that ensures the security of Israel and at the same time gives the Palestinians a viable state. This does involve a bit of tough love, I think, with regard to Israel. And those of us who love Israel the most possibly believe that tough love is sometimes necessary. And I think a control of the settlement activity is a condition for the ultimate creation of a two-state solution. But it involves also bringing together or bringing on board a number of regional actors. And the major supporter of Hamas and Hezbollah is Iran at the moment. It is a matter of somehow engaging and bringing Iran into the task of making peace in the Middle East. And this leads me to a discussion of Iran. Let me say a few words about Iran. Iran is generally identified as the single gravest threat facing the United States, the biggest challenge facing U.S. foreign policy. Obviously, its position has been strengthened regionally, partly, not wholly, but partly as a result of our invasion of Iraq. And what worries us most is the prospect that the uranium enrichment program in Iran will produce, and estimates place this date somewhere between 2009 and 2015, enough nuclear material, enough enriched uranium to produce atomic weapons. This does not mean that the next step, which is that of taking that enriched uranium and weaponizing it, applying it to actual weapons, is a step that will easily be taken, but it's on the horizon. And if today's confirmation hearings of Hillary Clinton are any indication, and general statements by both Democrats and Republicans, there will be an enormous amount of pressure on President Obama to tighten economic sanctions and other punitive pressures against Iran. And what I would advise is that the President and his foreign policy associates ask themselves, what results have punitive pressures produced in the past? And I think that they will find that the answer is that punitive pressures have strengthened the domestic political position of those who, within Iran, have the least commitment to their countries playing a constructive international role. And I think that they will find that every surge of economic sanctions has been accompanied by an acceleration of the uranium enrichment activities within Iran. And so one asks oneself, if punitive pressures have not done the trick, what would? And it seems to me that the first step is to understand that Iran is not monolithic, it's not politically monolithic, that it's a complex entity in which there are a variety of political players, and the task of the international community should be to strengthen the hand of those political players who are least enthusiastic about nuclear programs, and who, if nuclear weapons are acquired by Iran, and we have to recognize that the possibility exists that they will be, we want to promote the position of those players in whose hands we would least fear the possession of nuclear weapons. Is it possible to have a Pakistani kind of solution to this problem? And again, I'm simplifying things somewhat, but it's generally recognized that the three levels of political players, or three tiers of political players in Iran. There are the traditional conservatives, those who believe very firmly in the legacy of the Islamic Revolution and the teachings of Ayatollah Khomeini. These are people like Khamenei. These are people like Ahmadinejad. These are people who believe in the primacy of religious over secular authority and who have least interest in cooperating with the West and in promoting peace with Iran. A second tier within the Iranian political system are what are called the pragmatic conservatives. These are people like former presidential candidate Larijani, former President Rafsanjani, Rizai, who is the former commander of the Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran. These are people who believe in the basic tenets of a religious society and in religious rule, but who are afraid that this society and this regime will slip out from under them because of the economic dissatisfaction caused in Iran. And Iran is a situation that combines high unemployment, relatively low growth rates, with a population that has recently expanded considerably and that is very young and volatile. The average age of the population in Iran is less than 26 at the moment. This is a very, very young and potentially volatile population. And the pragmatic conservatives generally wish to reintegrate Iran into the international economy in such a way that the economic problems and economic dissatisfaction are resolved before the foundations of the Islamic State are undermined by this dissatisfaction. And then the third tier are what you might call the authentic reformers, the people like former President Khatami, many businessmen and economists in Iran who believe that a democratic society, a secular democratic society, is what Iran needs, and a full integration into the international community. Now, these are perhaps represent numerically the largest part of the population, but reformers and reformist politicians have been thoroughly discredited by the failure of Khatami while he was president to generate the kind of economic growth that the nation needs. Partly one of the reasons why he has failed to do so is because, quite simply, of the economic pressures and economic sanctions which the country has faced. But what I would like to see is a policy that engages Iran, reintegrates it into the international economic system to the extent that the position of those who believe in reform and moderation and who believe in pragmatic economic goals rather than gossamer theological goals, to have their hands strengthened as much as possible. But it is by changing the equilibrium of forces within Iran that the problem will be resolved, not by punitive pressures. Let me say a few words about North Korea because I'm running out of time. Believe me, North Korea is a more immediate problem than is the problem of Iran. Why? Because North Korea has atomic nuclear weapons. Iran does not. It has tested one, not entirely successfully, but it has presumably learned a lot from its semi-successful test in the summer of 2006. It also has a considerable missile delivery capacity, including the medium-range Donong missile and the long-range Taepadong missile, which has Alaska, Hawaii, and possibly the west coast of the United States, where we sit now, within its reach. So I would regard this as the more pressing problem, and it is particularly pressing, I think, at the moment, because the North Korean regime seems to be heading toward a possible meltdown. The problem is that the regime has not managed to provide its citizens with the basic economic gratifications that every government is assumed responsible for. It has presided over a constant permanent famine in North Korea. Millions died during the famine of 95-96. According to some estimates, we're facing in the coming year the possibility of a famine of somewhat lesser scale in this country. It is probably the most indoctrinated society in the world, but nevertheless, people cannot help but be aware of the fact that their own society and own economy is doing so much worse than every other possible society they choose to use as a reference. You take all of these threats to the legitimacy of the Stalinist regime in North Korea, and you add to it the fact that Kim Jong-il, the current leader, is in very, very dubious health. He apparently suffered a stroke a few months ago. He has not been seen in public. There are claims according to which he has had brain surgery in recent weeks. If he dies, the last pillar of legitimacy that the North Korean regime has will have crumbled. And this pillar of legitimacy simply comes from the whatever charisma has rubbed off from Kim Il-sung, his father, onto him. It can no longer be passed on to his own sons. That veneer has become too thin. It's likely in the next 4 years that we will face dire political problems in North Korea. Two possibilities: a soft landing or a crash landing. A soft landing means that the regime ceases to exist, the state persists, some stable political authority is still there, a stable political authority that might one day conduct the reforms that could make North Korea a member of the international society. North Korea might follow the path of another personality cult communist dictatorship, and that is the Romanian one, if this happens. The other possibility is that of a crash landing. The state ceases to function, the bureaucracy disintegrates, basic services are no longer provided, the economy is in a meltdown, and the military command structure disintegrates. And that is what's worrying Pentagon planners and the intelligence community the most at the moment, because you have a military force, 1 million people strong, 1 million men strong, that is accustomed to privileged treatment, especially the special forces, and which it is feared would break down into fiefs of regional commanders who would act as warlords, struggling for control of whatever remains of economic resources, and you would have a situation not similar to that facing Romania, that Romania encountered, but to that facing Somalia or the Congo. When you consider that there are chemical and biological weapons to be had, when you consider the fact that there are nuclear weapons to be had, it boggles the imagination, it boggles the mind. And I would think that probably the greatest immediate challenge to the Obama administration might be to ensure or to do what it can to make a soft landing more likely, and this means, again, reintegrating North Korea into international society, creating the basis for social and political stability once the regime ceases to exist. By the way, the United States would probably be called for, because of the threat to South Korea, to establish a military presence if the regime imploded. China would not easily welcome this, and it's very likely that China would seek to establish a presence too. And in fact, there have been negotiations between China and the United States to try to ensure the conditions of mutual restraint in the event that this happens. Well, I have pretty much run out of time. Let me simply say that the economic problems facing the administration might, I fear, not allow it to devote the attention that its foreign challenges deserve. On the other hand, the good news is that we do have a president who is immensely capable, with a foreign policy team of whom I have a very high opinion, and with potential support in both the House of Representatives and in the Senate. So I think it's at least even odds that, but no better than even odds, that these threats will be successfully dealt with. Thank you.
I would like to thank the speakers, and before I open it up, I was deliberating while I was listening to this presentation of whether to send a tape of this panel to President-elect Obama. And there's a good reason for doing so. I think what we've heard here is important analysis of structural issues that we read aspects of them in the newspapers or listen to them in the news shows. But one of the things that I took out of this panel is that many of these problems are long-standing, structural, and have been left unattended, not only by the recent administration, but by other administrations, and it's high time to tackle them. Now, only for this reason alone, it's important for the president-elect to understand these problems, because understanding the enormity of the problem and the fact that he will be facing a multitude of different problems and different issue areas on day one is 50% of the solution. And I think that understanding this problem is something that has characterized the Obama campaign. It has characterized also the campaign of John McCain, but we have different perspective, and one perspective won. And I think that there is a chance and there is an expectation that that Obama will be able to, or is better equipped for a wide variety of reasons, some of them were mentioned here, to tackle these problems. But eventually I decided against sending this tape. Rather than sending this tape to President Obama, I decided that we should keep this tape and perhaps meet a year from now on a regular basis and see what happened. So with this, let me open it up for questions. Now, what I would like you to is to limit your interventions to brief questions. We have a number of microphones spread around the room, so when you raise your hand, somebody will come to you with a microphone. Please introduce yourself, introduce the speaker to whom you address your question to, and we'll have the panelists respond to each question in turn. Yes, sir.
This question is for Professor Larson. I can't read your name right, is that correct? I'm a graduate student here, and I heard that Senator Obama said over the weekend, when asked about whether he would appoint a special prosecutor, that he seemed very reluctant to do that and was talking about looking forward and now how he needs to have a good relationship with the CIA. And but he also said that his attorney general should be the people's lawyer, and basically he seemed vaguely saying that if the attorney general would decide to prosecute or investigate crimes such as war crimes or torture, that he might not stop him from doing so. Could you comment on that issue?
Yeah, sure. This is, I think, a very difficult problem for President Obama for exactly the reasons you mentioned. First of all, it is possible that various members of the Bush administration committed acts that probably fall within the scope of certain federal criminal prohibitions. And that would mean that the Obama administration, if it wanted to, might choose to make this a priority, to try former Bush administration officials for crimes and hope to see them imprisoned. And there's certainly a strong push for that by many people, particularly I think some of the most liberal backers of Senator Obama are particularly hopeful that that will happen. My sense is that you're reading him correctly when you saw a considerable amount of reluctance by him to do that. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. First of all, it doesn't really change or improve anything significant going forward. That is, it doesn't tangibly put more money in anybody's pocket. It doesn't, make as particularly more safe. It doesn't, on its own terms, sort of advance a significant overarching goal. It's backward-looking rather than forward-looking. And secondly, I think he may be concerned that we don't in this country fall into a spiral in which mistakes of judgment, even very serious mistakes of judgment by prior administrations, become the subject of criminal prosecutions by incoming administrations. That is that perhaps the best thing to do is simply to let bygones be bygones. Let's forget about the Bush administration and not even think about it anymore, and hope that we cannot essentially criminalize certain aspects of our politics. But that said, I think that's a very difficult position for the reasons you mentioned, particularly if some of the acts that were committed were severe. It's a tough problem.
Yes.
Professor Taylor, if the economy gets worse, will there be a serious case of famine? Do you think it'll get to that?
No.
No?
Not in the United States. No. North Korea? I'll defer to my colleagues, but I think the economic downturn will be very serious in some countries, and there will be certainly major problems for a lot of developing countries that are very exposed to international trade. There are going to be severe problems there. There already are in terms of the functioning of the international economy. So I think we're going to read a lot about hardships within our own economy, but we're also going to hear a lot of horror stories about what's happening elsewhere in countries which are less fortunate in terms of their starting point, in terms of their income per capita, their safety nets, and their exposure to all kinds of other risks.
I'm trying to see if there are questions from this side of the room. Yes.
The sociology professor. So Obama's infrastructure plan to be projected. Do you think that it'll have a severe or even significant effect on the education and racial inequality gaps?
Could you start your question again? His what infrastructure?
Sorry, Obama's infrastructure revitalization plan, where he's going to invest a lot of money in there.
His revitalization plan is really focused on the economy, so there will be carryover effects. I think that it's still a very open question whether or not the stimulus plan and the way that the starting point that he has anything or has much to learn, or if we can expect a similar income compression that we saw after the Great Depression and the New Deal response to that. I think it's unclear whether or not we should expect to see a similar compression given this stimulus plan. I think that there's a lot of variables that aren't necessarily on the table with regards to income inequality. I think that the focus is really on getting the economy going, and I'm not sure that that will have any effect toward redressing inequalities. Certainly, so far, I don't think that the economic recovery or rescue plans that have been accomplished so far, given the Bush administration, certainly haven't been geared toward reducing inequality.
May I ask a second question?
Is that okay with you?
Sure.
If his plan is successful and it creates 3 million jobs, do you think those jobs will have a significant effect on the educational gap? Like, will they create enough, housing, you said, was very important to people having incomes well enough to go into college?
Okay, so the financing of education is one thing, the family level financing of higher education, and that definitely depends on what is going on with the cost of higher education as well. The home ownership and home values are very closely tied to the budgets that local school districts are able to and state level funding of schools. So the housing crisis has an effect on that. So places like the Central Valley of California, south of us, that are seeing high rates of foreclosures are going to be experiencing significant fiscal crises in their education systems. California is in for a rough ride when it comes to education. I'm not sure if the creation of jobs has far-reaching effects. Whether or not I couldn't map out whether or not they would have an effect on equalizing access to higher education, absent specific policies that are specifically aimed at increasing equity and access to higher education.
Mary? Over here.
Okay, this question is for Professor Taylor. As responsible citizens, or basically the American population, should we be spending or saving, in view of our economy and the recession that we're supposed to be going through? Because obviously, we want to be careful, but at the same time, if that's only going to make it worse, if everybody's not putting any money into the economy. So what should we be doing?
Well, I've got an investment fund I'd like to I think personal circumstances will obviously vary, but if you want me to make a sort of general statement about what's been going on, obviously there's been an enormous hit to household balance sheets. Households have seen the value of their main asset, their house, decline, at least for the 3/4 of the people who own a home. They've also seen other assets on their balance sheets decline in value because of the financial crisis affecting stock prices and so forth. I mean, some people may have timed the market and gotten out and so forth. But on average, there's been a huge wealth shock. Right? That's going to compound the problems of the business cycle, because people are going to be cutting back on consumption, not only because they're out of a job or they have a lower income, but also because they have lower wealth. So I think going forwards, I mean, the vast majority of people probably have some target level of wealth in mind that they would feel comfortable with as protection against a rainy day or as a target for retirement or whatever. And so individuals like banks and other entities are going to want to rebuild their balance sheet. So I would expect most people to be moving into more of a saving mode. And I think in terms of individual and household responsibility and good management, that probably makes a good deal of sense. In terms of the macroeconomic impact, it leaves the question of where aggregate demand is going to come from. So that's the government's problem.
Yes, over there.
Professor Shauman, in view of the dire picture that you presented, especially regarding the racial disparities in this country, what would you advise the incoming administration regarding their immigration policies?
Good question. Well, I am not an immigration specialist. Immigration in the more, well, there's immigration policy and there's illegal immigration policy. Our immigration policies have been encouraging the immigration of very highly skilled employable persons to drive the high-tech part of our economy. That policy, I think, is one that has been driving some aspect of our economy. I would defer to Alan about an analysis of that. Our policies around illegal immigration, I think, is another extreme. That's an illegal immigration is a social issue, a social challenge that really needs to be dealt with. Whether or not the current levels of immigration that we see will be maintained given the fiscal crisis, I'm not sure. I think probably, given what Alan has said about our, it's all relative, right? And we should fare relatively well given the global crisis. But I expect that the current fiscal crisis will lead to relative conservatism when it comes to the expansion of benefits to possibly include illegal immigrants. I personally think, and I think from a sociological perspective, that the expansion of educational benefits, the expansion of benefits without regard to citizenship status is a more equitable way to go and probably more healthy for the populace as a whole. I don't think that our current fiscal crisis will lead to that sort of liberal aspect to the distribution of social services.
Yes? Over here?
I'd like to thank each of you for being here tonight. I know and I hope the audience appreciates your contribution. And my question is in regards to, and it's to the person best qualified. If you foresee a devaluation in the dollar, I understand it's been on a current downward trend. And I mean, we have our trust in our financial institutions, but with the FDIC increasing its insurance balance sheets, with raising the limit to $100,000 for individuals covering, as well as the Treasury Department just being loaded with toxic assets, I was wondering what kind of effects it will have in that trust, and if it might lead to a potentially threatening downward trend in the global economy as well.
I guess that's a question for me. Okay. Well, recently the dollar's been strengthening, right? So, which may sound perverse given some of the longer run trends you spoke about, but that I think reflects the safe haven status of this country and of our Treasury securities. but obviously one can go to the well too often, and we could abuse that if we borrow too much. Similarly, in terms of our fiscal policy, if we run too far into debt, I'm not too worried about those levels of debt indebtedness at the moment, but going forward we'll have to be rather careful about that, and we will need to address, I think, the deeper structural fiscal problems in the country in terms of, unsustainable war expenses, unsustainable tax cuts, unsustainable Medicare costs, various things that, they're like these third rails that nobody wants to touch, and we may be able to stabilize our debt relative to GDP, or maybe not. It only takes a slight miscalculation there, and it's like the universe, it could just blow up or it could be stable, but we only have to get our parameters just a little bit wrong, and down the road we're sitting on a huge pile of debt. That's fiscal policy. On monetary policy, I think the Fed is also in a bit of a delicate position. It's expanding liquidity in the money base very quickly. There could be a lot of dollars floating around if they don't suck that liquidity back in when the financial problems subside. So we have to place a lot of trust in our Treasury and Federal Reserve policymakers to handle that carefully. However, the one final thing I would say is, again, it's all relative. There are going to be similar problems faced by other countries. In a downturn, there's going to be financial and fiscal problems and solvency problems affecting the European Union, Britain, and other countries, which you might think, play as rivals in terms of reserve currency status or safe haven status for investors around the world. Well, they're going to be coping with the same problems. So I think there's going to be a lot of volatility and uncertainty. But short of putting gold in your mattress, I don't know what to advise. Your mattress will then fall through the floor, and you'll have other problems.
Yeah.
I have a question for Professor Nincic about the Middle East. It seems to me that a two-state solution is farther away than ever with the current situation in Gaza, and I'm wondering whether, I'm not talking so much about policy makers as policy thinkers now, whether it's time perhaps to be thinking about something beyond a two-state solution, that is to say, a more decentralized framework of power whereby Gaza is not in fact going to come back under the control of Ramallah, and Ramallah is not, nor is Gaza ever going to gain control over Ramallah, but that Israelis and Palestinians are going to have to work out some kind of a political framework that isn't based on two sovereign states facing each other.
It's very hard to think of a credible alternative to a two-state solution, and the most important reason for not bothering terribly much about thinking about alternatives to a two-state solution is because a one-state solution has been thoroughly rejected. A two-state solution has been in principle embraced not only by the regional players, it has been embraced by the United States, it has been embraced by the European Union, it has been embraced by virtually every consequential player on the international scene. One might try to think of hybrid solutions, but the hybrid solutions are not part of what drives the political desires of the principal players in the Middle East, and certainly would fall far short of what drives the aspirations of the Palestinians. I simply don't think that a constituency for anything other than a two-state solution exists at the moment, nor is likely to exist. One could, in the comfort of our academic offices, try to devise hybrids, but these hybrids would have so little bearing on the aspirations and the relevant players in the field that I can't believe that they would gain any kind of traction. A two-state solution is very far away. It is also the only goal toward which anybody is seriously heading, no matter how distant and remote it seems at the moment.
Yes, at the very end over there.
This question's for Professor Taylor. I'm wondering whether the United States will now consider the 401k experiment a failure, and if we'll be establishing some sort of governmental pension system. 2, whether the media has been ignoring the derivatives market as well as the over-leveraging of consumers. For example, let's say an American has $20,000 to $30,000, $40,000 of credit card debt currently. Say they've been laid off and they've just been using those checks they send to cycle their debt. I mean, you can have the government...
You get those too, huh?
Yeah. You can get the government to buy the bad assets of corporations, but do you think we'll be seeing a bubble in credit card debt? Third, in regards to monetary policy, do you think this economic crisis has put Milton Friedman to shame, and whether we finally will test Keynesianism on the global stage, if you, in fact, do you believe it will succeed?
Okay, I think there were 3 questions there. The first one was about 401ks and private saving. I don't think we would want to discourage private saving, and we do have a public safety net of some sort in the form of the social security system. So I think that hybrid is liable to remain, and I don't see any reason to dissuade private saving. In fact, people have rather a lot of that catching up to do, and keeping it tax advantaged right now is probably a good thing. If we abolish that, I think that would. We already have a low saving rate, and we wouldn't want to discourage it any further. The second question was about
consumer debt.
Consumer debt. There was something about derivatives which I missed, but
just whether you believe that's been ignored. Whether
consumer debt. I think people have been going on and on about consumer debt for 10 or 20 years. I mean, it's been rising steadily on a trend, and people have sounded alarms about that, and that's one of the reasons why we have extremely fragile balance sheets in the household sector right now. And yeah, in this coming year, we're going to see a lot of credit card debt as the economy, or over the next 2 years as the economy tumbles. So if you think, subprime was the end of it, no. Now we're going to see commercial bankruptcies and household bankruptcies because of these debt burdens. And that will be how that problem is solved. There will be a lot of people who simply can't pay, and that'll be further damage to the balance sheets of the financial institutions and banks that issued those credit card debts. So if you're looking for a very cheap piece of Citigroup you want to buy next week, the credit card division is probably going very cheap. But unfortunately, prices can't go negative. So, I don't know what they're going to do with that. So going forwards, will this be salutary? Will individuals save more and encumber themselves with less debt? Well, we can hope. But whether we want some short of direct intervention, maybe there are certain incentives one can tinker with. I mean, some of the policy advisors to Obama, like Cass Sunstein, who's the co-author of this book, Nudge, and all these other behavioral economists who are very much in that crowd, I think we can make some changes, some of which are already being implemented in the private sector. Like you should be automatically enrolled in the 401k rather than having to choose it. So that might encourage people to do more saving and so forth. So there may be some little steps we can take there. But heading down, further down the road towards, telling people what to do with their finances might not really hold sway. And the last question was Keynesianism versus monetarism.
Just regard to the invisible hand versus the government's hand.
Well, there's always a sort of give and take there. But it could be that 50 years from now we'll look back on this moment as the end of capitalism or something. But I'm not quite seeing that. I'm not quite seeing that at the moment, but I don't think we're going to carry on with business as usual either. There's probably going to be a little bit more financial regulation, and the housing market might be subject to regulation, the mortgage finance area. So there'll be sort of give and take on some margins, but I don't quite see this as a sort of George Bush like Kim Jong-il. Once he goes, everything will change. But we'll be going through a time of political and policy trial and error.
Do you believe we'll be heading more towards a social democracy type of model or just is our culture too?
I thought we had that
in the United States.
I mean, do you mean we're heading towards Norway or
Yeah.
I think we could be heading, yes, marginally in that direction. How far? I don't know. I certainly expect to see healthcare reforms at the federal level, given all the promises made. Education is much more of a reserve to the states kind of question, and there, that may be a little bit more intractable in terms of federal policy. You can change No Child Left Behind, but are you going to be able to change funding and equalize opportunity? In education, maybe not so much. But I think healthcare is much more amenable to a big solution at the federal level. Of course, it's much more amenable to failure, as we found out in '94. So we'll see.
Just last question. With regards to global aid, do you think that we will be increasing global aid to third world developing nations?
Not right now, but there's going to be a lot of pressure on budgets. I mean, I think, if one could find some, good thing to say about Bush, it's that he did increase the aid budget, and some other countries have been living up to those commitments, others have not been. But it's going to be a bit of a bleak time for making those arguments, given all the other demands on the fisc in the next few years.
We have time for 2 more questions. We'll take a question from here. Then the lady over there in the middle.
Okay, my question is for Professor Nincic, and I'm wondering, during the campaign, Obama had talked a lot about how we had really failed in Afghanistan by pulling out so quickly, and I know you didn't really get time to address it, but I'm wondering, it seemed like at first, at least, his plan was to kind of reassign troops more so to Afghanistan, and since there's been so much talk about how exhausted our military is, I want to know if you think that would be more of a harm than a help to the U.S., basically.
Ultimately, Afghanistan is a far more difficult a challenge, something that's less amenable even to a military solution than was the challenge of Iraq. The last thing I would like to see is for Afghanistan to become the next big sinkhole down which American lives and money are spent. You're talking about a country that has far less of a civil society than Iraq did, literacy rate that's approximately 1/3 of that which you had in Iraq, where ethnic rivalries are more intractable because the ethnic composition is even more fragmented than it is in Iraq. Our goal in 2001 was to destroy the Al-Qaeda command structure. We did not destroy it, we shoved it into Pakistan. Our goal then morphed into this impossible goal of state building in Afghanistan. I would hope that we will abandon that goal. I think that there are things far short of a major military effort that we can do there. And the thing that has been proposed, and I think it is the only reasonable additional step we can take, is to try to do something that resembles what was done with awakening councils in Iraq, which is to try to essentially buy off as many tribal leaders as possible, with the understanding that they would not provide hospitality to the Taliban, that they would provide intelligence on them, and so forth. But a major military effort is doomed to failure. It'll be very, very expensive. I have no problem with focusing a military effort on the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan. That's a small, manageable area with identifiable targets and so forth. I think that Afghanistan would be a sinkhole. I hope that Obama does not deliver on his particular promise to shift major military resources into that country.
Last question over there.
Okay, so my question is for Professor Taylor. So you were discussing about how the long-term effects of the recession would still be affecting us long after the recession. So that means it's going to be affecting my generation and generations after. So I was just wondering, what are some of those effects, and what can we be doing now to cushion those effects possibly?
Okay. All right. Well, going to college and getting an education, that's a good start. I think making investments in yourself for the global economy of the 21st century. I think Kimberlee's charts were very clear on income inequality. A large part of that is a skill premium. And the most skilled people are getting much higher wages than less skilled people. And that's, we think, driven a lot by technological changes, and it's not going to reverse anytime soon, I don't think. And this is despite the fact that on the supply side, what was this campus like 30 or 40 years ago? Educating, 1/10 this number of students, and across the country we've been increasing the supply of relatively skilled individuals. Despite that, this premium to the highly educated keeps on going up and up, despite huge increases in the supply of the relatively skilled. So I think the number one thing that you can do is keep investing in human capital, in yourself, and probably college isn't the place to stop, not just with a first degree. So that would be probably the first thing I would say. And the other thing that strikes me, and it goes back to some of the other questions, is that this is a very indebted society, a society that likes a lot of consumption, and I like consumption like the next person. Likes to own houses, and if one compared that with other countries around the world, has that made us happier? Not quite so clear. So, perhaps going forward, setting meaningful goals for financial stability and saving, as opposed to focusing on as much on consumption, might be a good thing for everyone going forward.
And as always, the economists have the last word. So I would like to thank our distinguished panel, and I would like to thank all of you for coming, for your patience, and for your interesting questions. Thank you very much, and good night.